There are two quite different ways of thinking about trans inclusion. One is that trans people want to be treated a certain way, and in order to attain that treatment, they need to look like the people who get treated that way. That means they need what has been called gender-affirming care. Although, as will be immediately evident, that can't mean gender in the sense we've been talking about it in the course so far, which is socialization and treatment on the basis of sex. There has to be a thing already there to be affirmed by the care, where effective care will then get them the social treatment. Medical and surgical interventions can make a man look like a woman, and looking like a woman can get him treatment as a woman. That thing that is already there tends to get called gender identity. So what is really gender identity affirming care gets you gender in one sense. Obviously, it can't change your socialization before that point, but if successful, it can change your social treatment after that point. So one thing we'll talk about in this lecture is gender affirming care, the arguments for and against it, and where it conflicts, if it does, with feminism. The other way of thinking about trans inclusion is not that there is something trans people want and a particular way that we can help them get it, but that there is something trans people are and a particular way we can change the world to help them fit more easily in it. That change is to our understanding of what women and men are, from a sex-based understanding to a regardless of sex, identity-based understanding. Some also think we must change our understanding of what female and male are, perhaps because it is simply too jarring to talk about female men and male women. But because there is more disagreement about that, I'm just going to talk about man and woman, which pretty much everyone on the trans-inclusive side at least agrees about. So the other thing we'll talk about in this lecture is reasons to think trans women are women. With gender-affirming care, we change trans people to fit the world. With trans inclusion in the second sense, we change the world to fit trans people. In part 1, I'll say something brief about how this topic of trans inclusion relates to the topic of lecture 4. In parts 2 and 3, we'll cover so-called gender-affirming care. Part 2 will be the for, and part 3 will be the against. And in part 4, we'll cover some of the philosophical arguments for trans women being women. Okay, part 1, sex abolitionism repackaged. In lecture 4, we talked about two prominent solutions feminists of the second wave had offered to patriarchy: sex abolitionism and gender abolitionism. The former seeks to eliminate the basis of sex discrimination. If there is no sex, then there can be no discrimination on the basis of sex. The latter seeks to retain the concept of sex in order that sex differences be acknowledged and accommodated, leaning instead on the sex-gender distinction and pushing for the abolition of gender, understood as the norms and expectations applied to people on the basis of their sex. That men should be masculine and that women should be feminine. These two solutions are in tension because what the sex abolitionists will see as necessary to their vision for a feminist future, the gender abolitionists will see as undermining the basis for the accommodation of difference that is needed to get us to their vision for a feminist future. Or at least they will think that if we take the sex abolitionists route, there will be a lot more harm to women in the short term, even if we end up in the same place eventually. If we don't know who the women are, because there are just people, then we won't be able to pull the women up to equality with men. In the last decade or so, there has been a pivot in the way the sex abolitionists make their argument. Instead of defending the core claims directly, arguing that there is no natural thing, sex, or arguing that sex is socially constructed and that it is possible to deconstruct it, and that doing so would be the best route to women's liberation, some of the feminists on this side instead argue indirectly via taking up what they see as the human rights issue of another group. They say that they are arguing for the human rights of trans people, that trans people have or need a particular view of gender, and that view is gender as identity, and it requires sex abolitionism, or at the very least requires very much trivializing the role that sex plays, and giving primacy instead to gender identity in place of sex. This is a shift from disagreement over facts, what sex is and whether there is sex, to a disagreement over values, primarily inclusion, but also things like caring for the vulnerable, interpersonal respect and recognition, and more. I don't think it's melodramatic to say that this disagreement has exploded into an all-out culture war. This general strategy, whether it's intentional or not, of arguing for one side of a contested feminist issue by reframing the issue as a defense of another minority group, can also be seen in some of the arguments over the surrogacy industry. Instead of arguing for or against surrogacy on its own terms, for example, in terms of how it impacts women, some instead argue that surrogacy is a human rights issue for LGB people, where what they really mean is that it's an issue for gay men in particular, who cannot have children at all without surrogates and egg donors. This is politically savvy because it's emotional. Progressive people care about minority groups, so if surrogacy can be framed as a human rights issue for gay men rather than a women's rights issue, there is more likely to be support for surrogacy. The same applies to the sex abolitionist feminists. Whether it is intentional or not, they can gain more political support for their position by framing it as a trans rights issue rather than arguing directly for the comparative unimportance of sex compared to gender identity, or defending the priority given to the values that put gender identity ahead of sex, compared to other values like safety, fairness, privacy. And it's important to note that this strategy has worked. In Australia, for example, there is now no category of biological sex protected in federal or state anti-discrimination law, state vilification law, our interpretation of international human rights law, and so on. Australian law is sex abolitionist in the sense that it has moved to the voluntarist gender identity concept of the trans activists and trans-inclusive feminists. Sex has become gender identity. Even where some law names both as protected attributes, the meaning of sex is legal sex, and anyone can change their legal sex, and even where they haven't, the separate protection of gender identity is generally taken to give them the legal protections they would have had they changed their legal sex. So if you watched Lecture 4 and thought gender abolition was obviously a better strategy than sex abolition, as my students did in every year I taught the two together, you are now in a practical disagreement with what is better known as sex self-ID law, in place in many countries. Part 2. Gender-Affirming Care. In his 2022 paper, Integrity and Rights to Gender-Affirming Healthcare in the Journal of Medical Ethics, Rach Cosker-Rowland makes the instrumental argument for gender-affirming care that I've already sketched. He writes, "The social changes that GAH, gender-affirming healthcare, enables are essential to many trans and non-binary people's desired transitions. Many trans people's desired transition involves their being generally treated by others as members of the gender with which they identify rather than the gender they were assigned at birth. But trans people are not generally treated in these ways socially until they look more like a member of the gender with which they identify than a member of the gender they were assigned at birth. They are not treated as a man or woman until they pass as a man or woman, at least in dominant social contexts. And it is much easier for many trans people to pass if they have had certain kinds of GAH, and some trans people can only pass with GAH. In some, to be able to be taken as a woman or man, many trans women and men need GAH." He does say what he means by being generally treated by others as a member of a gender. Here are his examples. Not being subjected to the social norms associated with the gender that they were assigned at birth, people generally referring to them with the pronouns of that gender, not misgendering them, grouping them in with the gender with which they identify when there are such groupings, and permitting them to use spaces for the gender with which they identify rather than another gender. More concretely, many trans women want to be treated as women in public, to be thought of as women when shopping rather than stared at and treated as weird for being in the women's clothing section or using female changing rooms. Many trans men want to be seen as one of the guys by other men and treated as such. Obviously, the mere fact that a trans woman wants treatment as a woman and that gender-affirming healthcare would help him get it is not a sufficient argument for the provision of gender-affirming healthcare. Although for a liberal, it may be a sufficient argument for the provision of a commercial service to adults so long as there is another party interested to provide that service, along the lines of the current cosmetic industry. So we now need to turn to rationales for gender-affirming care as healthcare. Two main strategies have been pursued. The first are health-based rationales, the second autonomy-based rationales. In terms of health, it has been claimed by activists that gender-affirming treatments are life-saving and medically necessary, in particular that they prevent suicide. For recent reporting on this in connection to a US court case, see the Selin Davis reference in the video description, and for evidence in relation to World Health Organization guidance, see the block reference in the video description. Or it might be argued that particular values, like autonomy, support the provision of gender-affirming care, whether it is needed for health or not. Perhaps in response to revelations that gender-affirming care is not supported on health grounds, there has been a shift in the last couple of years to defending gender-affirming care on alternative value grounds. And those are what I'll focus on here. First, from an article in New York Magazine by trans author Andrea Long-Chu, and the second from an article by trans legal scholar Florence Ashley. Chu, writing in March 2024, responded, among other things, to US Republicans having introduced bills that would ban gender-affirming healthcare for minors. He claimed that around half of all transgender youth, some 140,000 kids and teens, now live in a state where minors have or may soon have no legal access to gender-affirming care. He criticized the left for having hung trans rights on the thin peg of gender identity, describing gender identity as a concept clumsily adapted from psychiatry and strongly influenced by both gender studies and the born this way tactics of the campaign for marriage equality. Chu said that this had left a vacuum where an account of why gender identity justifies the biological interventions of gender-affirming care should be. If it's the suffering of gender dysphoria, then gender-affirming care is treatment of disease. And that, he states, is pathologizing of trans kids. Instead, Chu writes, we must be able to defend this desire, meaning the desire of a child who wishes to have their biological sex changed, clearly, directly, and crucially, without depending on the idea of gender. He continues, sex itself is becoming a site of freedom, the freedom to be whichever sex one prefers. And a little later in the article, we will never be able to defend the rights of transgender kids until we understand them purely on their own terms, as full members of society who would like to change their sex. It does not matter where this desire comes from. A little later again, we must be prepared to defend the idea that, in principle, everyone should have access to sex-changing medical care, regardless of age, gender identity, social environment, or psychiatric history. Chu's argument in the article was that there is already sex-changing medical care, namely the hormone therapy offered to menopausal women, the hormone therapy that helps a person with an intersex condition return to their actual biological sex after being assigned to the other biological sex. Menopausal women are conceived by Chu as being at risk of losing their sex and being offered medication to keep it. Intersex people are conceived as being enabled through medicine to return to their real sex. We should simply offer this same right, albeit the right to change one's sex rather than to keep or return to it, to everyone. Gender-affirming care, Chu claims, is just one contemporary part of the longer tradition of sex-affirming care that has included breast reconstruction following cancer, vasodilators for erectile dysfunction, anti-androgens for hair loss and hirsutism, and genital surgeries for soldiers whose bodies were damaged in explosions. He includes IVF treatments within this same category. The article ends by defending the freedom of sex as a basic human right. Let anyone change their sex. Let anyone change their gender. Let anyone change their sex again. Let trans girls play sport regardless of their sex status. Let people use the gender-segregated facilities of their choice. Desegregate wherever possible. Do not out children to their parents. Do not force anyone to change their sex or their gender. Give everyone healthcare. Chu is insistent. Parents must learn to treat their kids as what they are, human beings capable of freedom. Chu concedes that children may be too young to consent to puberty blockers, but says if they are, they're also too young to consent to puberty. Chu does not explicitly take up critics' arguments about the health risks of gender-affirming care, including loss of bone mineral density, loss of sexual function, loss of fertility, risk of surgical complications, and unknown long-term complications relating to exogenous testosterone on female bodies and exogenous estrogen on male bodies, as well as, for detransitioners specifically, irreversible or difficult to fully reverse changes such as deepened voice or hair loss. The only thing Chu says is that the freedom of sex does not promise happiness, that where there is freedom, there will always be regret. Caring about health risks or the looming possibility of detransition is referred to as a fixation. No line is drawn between children and adults, even though it is standard in the liberal tradition to think that paternalism in the interests of children, in particular in keeping their future options open, is not merely justifiable but is expected. For Chu, it seems if someone wants to be the other sex, then the medical establishment should facilitate their being the other sex. Few, if any, questions asked. Perhaps some reservations are implied by the brief qualification, this does not mean shooting testosterone into every toddler who looks at a football, but he does not elaborate. Florence Ashley made similar arguments in 2022. Ashley framed adolescent medical transition as being a matter of achieving one's gender embodiment goals. It is effective if it satisfies that goal, which, Ashley said, it clearly does. That is to say, if a teenage girl identifies as a boy and wants to have a boy-typical chest, then her gender embodiment goal may be a flat chest, and her gender-affirming care will be effective when it gives her a flat chest. The argument is run by analogy between reproductive health, abortion and birth control, and gender-affirming care for adolescents. It's worth noting that this is specifically intended to speak to feminists. Ashley writes, "One of my main intended audiences are feminists who express a commitment to reproductive rights, but who are undecided or opposed to adolescent medical transition." He says, birth control, abortion, and adolescent medical transition are analogous insofar as they intervene on healthy physiological states, such as puberty, sexual traits, fertility, and pregnancy, by reason of the person's fundamental self-conception and desired life. All three treatments are not for an illness, involve core aspects of personal identity, and so are a matter of autonomy, and are crucial to the social equality of women and trans people, respectively. We don't ask whether birth control and abortion reduce distress or have a positive impact on medical health. We ask whether they are effective in delivering the patient's goals of terminating or preventing pregnancy. We should, Ashley thinks, take the same approach to adolescent gender transition. Chu and Ashley are speaking in the same voice then. Gender-affirming care, including for minors, should be available on the grounds that it gives the patient what they want. It is an exercise of the patient's freedom or choice. In the next part of the lecture, we'll look at a response to this argument from the philosopher and bioethicist Moti Gorin. Part 3. What is the aim of gender-affirming care? Gorin's paper begins with the observation that the bioethics literature contains significant differences and inconsistencies in how the aim of gender-affirming medical care, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery is understood. While some understand the aim to be improving mental health outcomes, others reject this as pathologizing and say affirmative care is about achieving the patient's embodiment goals. This is the position that we've just discussed. Gorin focuses on Ashley rather than both Ashley and Chu, presumably because Chu was writing in a popular venue rather than an academic venue. Gorin argues that the embodiment goals view is misguided. Let's see why he thinks so. His first point is that on this new view, in which transition is just a thing that some people want, not connected to distress or discomfort, then it's not clear why it belongs in the domain of medicine at all. Someone could be transgender in Ashley's sense of having a gender identity that does not correspond to the gender they were assigned at birth. Call this lack of correspondence incongruence, but incongruence does not entail distress, discomfort, illness, or disease. Here's how Gorin spells out the logic of the traditional health-based argument for gender-affirming care, and it's worth noting for its comparison to the Chu/Ashley rationale. G, so this is a variable standing in for some particular person, experiences non-pathological incongruence. G's non-pathological incongruence, or G's experience of their non-pathological incongruence, gives rise to pathological gender dysphoria, depression, suicidality, and so forth. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or surgery offer a favorable risk-benefit profile for the treatment of these pathological conditions, and clinicians have fiduciary duties of non-maleficence and beneficence with respect to G, duties that is to protect and promote G's health. Therefore, clinicians ought to offer puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or surgery to G. Okay, let me put that in simpler terms. Our friend George has a gender identity incongruent with his sex. This gives George gender dysphoria, depression, and so on. Gender-affirming healthcare would treat those conditions. George's clinician should act to promote George's health, so George's clinician should give George gender-affirming healthcare, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and/or surgeries. And here's how Gorin spells out the Ashley approach in contrast. G experiences non-pathological incongruence, and puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery can bring about the experiences of gender euphoria or experiences of creative transfiguration, or perhaps some other non-pathological experience G desires. Therefore, clinicians ought to offer puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or surgery. Note the reference to creative transfiguration relates to another of Ashley's papers, which Gorin discusses, where Ashley argues that the body is a kind of art piece we should be able to curate as a form of self-expression. Again, in simpler terms, our friend George has a gender identity incongruent with his sex. Gender-affirming healthcare will cause George gender euphoria or some other positive experience, so George's clinician should give George gender-affirming healthcare, puberty blockers, and so on. Both arguments take incongruence to be a natural part of human diversity and do not pathologize trans identification. The first argument justifies gender-affirming care by way of clinicians' duties to protect and promote the health of their patients, paired with the empirical claim that the relevant treatments do just that. But it is unclear how the second argument justifies its conclusion. Why would clinicians have any responsibility to offer medical or surgical transition in the second case? How can we get from the mere fact that someone is transgender, in the sense of experiencing incongruence between sex and gender identity, to the idea that they should receive medical intervention? We could rephrase this more strongly as an objection. Ashley and Chu may be right that medical and surgical transition are things a person should have access to simply because they want them, but that takes transition right out of healthcare and puts it into the spheres of recreational drug taking, like taking steroids as a part of bodybuilding, and elective or cosmetic surgery. And there's nothing to say that these choices should not be restricted in the case of minors, as many parallel choices in fact are. Gorin also takes up Ashley's argument by analogy to reproductive healthcare. Because reproductive healthcare is healthcare, perhaps the analogy from it to gender-affirming care gets us back in the game of saying that medical and surgical transition are healthcare. If they're relevantly the same, then it's wrong to treat trans healthcare differently. Gorin's objection is that reproductive healthcare is not relevantly similar to gender-affirming care. Ashley says reproductive healthcare is about autonomy and identity, women and girls deciding what they want their lives to be like. But Gorin says Ashley conflates the legal justification for access to reproductive healthcare with the medical justification. Ashley cites the US Supreme Court reasoning about why abortion is needed. But that legal decision was about the correct weighting of women's autonomy rights versus the state's interest in protecting human life. The woman's autonomy grounded her right to non-interference by the state when it came to decisions about reproduction. But that the state should not compel her decision is a separate matter from what a clinician must do. For clinicians are guided not only by the law, but also by medical ethics. Gorin says the risk-benefit profiles for contraception and abortion happen to be extremely favorable. It is far riskier health-wise to be pregnant, and far riskier than that to carry a child to term than it is to avoid pregnancy or to have an abortion. Considering only the duty of the clinician to her patient, contraception and abortion are medically justified. They protect and promote the patient's health. Reproductive healthcare is justified by its protection and promotion of patient health. So the analogy falls apart. It can be rescued only by returning to the traditional health-based argument for gender-affirming care that Chu and Ashley reject. And if it is returned to, the evidence base for whether gender-affirming care actually promotes health is relevant again. Gorin finishes his paper with a discussion of the proper place of autonomy in medical care. Clinicians must have patients' informed consent for medical interventions. Respecting autonomy means not being duplicitous or coercive about interventions. It doesn't mean doing whatever a patient wants for whatever reason. As Gorin puts it, when autonomy rights in medicine are viewed as grounding the legitimacy of demands or desires, rather than as grounding protections against unwanted interventions, medicine starts to run amok. Okay, for anyone who doesn't know much about this area but is curious, I would recommend reading Gorin's paper because it contains a useful history of the gender affirmative treatment model, a review of the evidence there is for it, and responses that different countries have made to the uncovering of that lack of evidence. Okay, is there a distinctively feminist objection to gender affirming care for minors? It may be entirely unobvious that there would be. It may seem that healthcare for trans people is one thing and feminism is entirely another. But here are some reasons to think they overlap. First, to be trans or gender diverse is to be gender non-conforming in a specific way. And feminism has as one of its major concerns protecting the gender non-conformity of female people without pathologizing it. Feminism wants women to be free to not be feminine. Second, epidemiological changes to trans cohorts in recent years have meant that teenage girls are disproportionately affected. Women, and lesbian and autistic women in particular, identifying as not women at all is at least arguably a phenomenon of interest to feminism. Third, if gender-affirming care enables social transition, then there will be an increase in male people in previously female-only spaces, like girls' sports teams or in girls' sleeping accommodations on school camps. And this may cause safeguarding and other social issues that adversely impact girls. If there is a feminist objection to that social transition, then there is a feminist objection against the gender-affirming care that enables it. For all these reasons and more, there are specifically feminist reasons to be interested in gender-affirming care. In case anyone is interested in more on this topic, I'll put some links in the video description. First to a video Gorin did for my channel earlier this year, and second to a discussion we had for the Brain in a Vat podcast. Okay, part 4. Arguments for trans women being women. We're turning now to the idea that trans inclusion requires a change in the world, specifically our gender categorization practices, because trans women are women and should be recognized and treated as such. One paper that has been fairly influential in trans philosophy is trans woman philosopher Talia Bettcher's Trans Identities and First Person Authority, from an edited collection published in 2009. One of the arguments in this paper is that trans people have first personal authority over their genders. Another is that current gender practices violate everyone's right to what he calls genital privacy. Let's take these in turn and see whether we think they establish that trans women really are women. First personal authority is what it sounds like, the greater authority that we as individuals have over particular types of knowledge. where greater means greater than anyone else. This might be about our experiences, for example, whether we are hot or cold or uncomfortable or in pain, and it might be about our beliefs, desires, preferences, fears, hopes, and so on. We are experts as to ourselves in this sense, even if we can be wrong for complicated psychological reasons. As Bettcher explains in the chapter, one can offer an epistemic argument for first personal authority, or one can offer an ethical argument. He thinks the epistemic argument fails, and so takes the ethical path, saying that when we assert these kinds of knowledge states, we also take responsibility for them and we can be held accountable for them. He writes, "I do not mean that they are always up to us in the sense that we have rational control over them. I mean one can be faulted for holding inappropriate, false, or irrational attitudes. Given that one is ethically responsible for one's attitudes, it makes sense that it is up to one to take responsibility for them by publicly avowing them or not." We can see the ethical case by considering some examples of violation of ethical first-person authority, like the domestic violence abuser who extorts the concession that his partner deliberately made the dinner too spicy to spite him, or going out on a date with someone who tells you you want to go home now. Okay, how does this idea apply to gender? Bettcher thinks one's self-identity or self-conception is just one of the things that is part of the knowledge that we have first personal authority over. Just as I know what I want, I know how I understand myself, and I can testify to that and take responsibility for it. He is very unclear on what woman means, such that it can be something I have first personal authority over, which is not to say that there isn't a lot of ink spilled in the paper gesturing in that direction. He appears to think that woman is a possible answer to the question of who one really is, and that it can be true that one really is that before one has taken any steps in the direction of becoming that. But without knowing what that is, the claim appears rather mysterious. If you accept that I can know that I'm cold, I have a pain in my left little toe, I believe in a Christian God, and I am a woman, where this last one doesn't merely mean I am female, then this will be an argument for you. If you think the last of these is an outlier, like I do, then it won't. Turning to the second argument, which involves the somewhat peculiar claim that we have a right to privacy about our genital status. This means no one else has a right to know what's in our pants, whether we have a vulva or a penis. Bettcher says it would be inappropriate for someone to come up to us and say, "Do you have a penis?" But, he says, our current pattern of gender presentation, with females presenting feminine and males presenting masculine, is just a way of signaling our genital status. And that means most of us are massively giving away our privacy. Then his next move is to say if we don't move away from doing this, then we'll be forced to think of trans people as being either liars or deceivers. If gender presentation is a signal of genital status, this sets up an appearance or reality contrast, which is the basis for the representation of trans people as deceivers, which figures frequently in cases of transphobic violence and attempts to blame the victim. "He tricked me, I didn't know that was really a man." Trans people have a gender presentation that is not a signal of genital status on the current system. In non-trans people, feminine presentation signals a vulva and masculine presentation signals a penis. But for trans people, there is feminine presentation and a penis, or masculine presentation and a vulva. To make this more vivid, imagine a case. Say you are a straight male at a bar and flirting with someone you think is female. You assume, based on female appearance, that this person will have a vulva. Suppose this is a passing trans woman, rather than someone obviously male but with some signals of femininity. So you propose going home together. Now, if you later discover a penis, you may feel lied to or tricked or deceived. On Bettcher's view, it was as though the person's appearance said out loud, "I have a vulva," and this turned out to be a lie. And just as a side note, the law in at least some countries agrees with the person who feels deceived. A trans woman in the UK was recently sentenced for sexual assault after performing sex acts on a straight man who believed the man was a woman. Presumably, Bettcher would think this a grave injustice against the trans person. Bettcher says it isn't fair to understand someone who is merely living in accordance with their identity as lying, tricking, or deceiving. If we're to not think of trans people as liars or deceivers, we'd better shift our ideas about what gender presentation actually signals. He thinks our current social practices don't leave much space for trans women to communicate that their gender presentation does not communicate their genital status. If we divorced appearance from expectations about genitals, then we'd make more space. These are two distinct claims, albeit related. First, we should want privacy about our genitals, and second, we shouldn't maintain a system that makes trans people into liars just for presenting themselves as they want to. As he puts it, trans politics must require that bodily privacy be expanded to include information about genital status. Gender presentation may not be taken to communicate genital status. Terms such as woman may not be deployed to circulate genital information. This is necessary to undo the mechanisms that construct trans people as deceivers or pretenders. Okay, does this argument succeed in showing that we must change our gender category concepts? Our first question must be, is it true that we should all want the right to genital privacy? This language makes it sound like a specific sort of privacy, like we shouldn't have to show them to other people, or other people can't trade pictures of them and laugh at them. But that's not what he means. He means the bare knowledge that one has either a penis or a vulva in virtue of being either male or female. There are, in fact, two sexes, and our evolutionary history has set us up exceptionally well to detect in each other which one we are. There does not seem to be any particular reason for non-trans people to object to someone knowing their sex, and therefore being able to deduce which type of genitals they have. Still, we might think that if trans people take particular exception to this because it sets them up as liars or deceivers, that's a reason to change the world so it doesn't do this. They are a minority group, and we do sometimes change the world to accommodate minority groups. To assess whether we must, we might consider whether there are simpler changes that could be made to avoid this outcome, and what the more radical change would cost to other stakeholders. In terms of simpler changes, why not excuse the lie where it doesn't matter? So for example, walking down the street where someone glances at what he thinks is a woman and has the thought, oh, I guess she has a vulva. In terms of simpler changes, why not excuse the lie where it doesn't matter? So for example, walking down the street where someone glances at what he thinks is a woman and has the thought, oh, I guess she has a vulva. And why not ask trans people not to tell the lie where it does matter? For example, when there is a question of consent to sex. They can not tell it, not by changing their appearance, but by disclosing their status as trans. In terms of other stakeholders, if gender categories were radically revised so that a woman could be a person of either sex, and so could a man, a female appearing person could have either type of body, and so could a male appearing person, then tracking sex may become difficult or impossible. This might hurt trans people themselves, for example, when they are discriminated against by being held to the gender norms of their sex. For anyone who knows the Amy Stevens case, that would be one example. It might undermine particular projects. Say, if the rationale for quotas in political parties was to get more female people into politics, but then the only people being selected to the women-only shortlists were trans women. And finally, especially if appearance were confounded enough, we would lose access to information about how a person had been socialized that might be highly relevant in some contexts, information which may be imperfect and yet still useful. Knowing that someone is male and was raised male gives us quite a lot of useful information, much more than merely has penis. A recent article in The Australian reporting on the sexual assault of a woman prisoner by a trans woman who had had full sex reassignment surgery is a case in point. The socialization as male is a better predictor of the behavior than whether the presentation had been superficially adapted to appear female. Let's now turn to one final paper. In her 2016 paper, The Woman Question, the philosopher Laurie Watson talks about how she is female but frequently perceived to be a man, and what she thinks this shows for how feminists should approach transgender issues. Her paper is written as an open letter to anyone who does not think trans women are women. Watson describes what she calls her evolution to the position that trans women are women. First, she says she listens to trans women. Second, she says she knows what it's like to be treated by others as you do not identify yourself, because she is always treated as a man when she is a woman. She wrote, "Perhaps having experienced my gender/sex so uniformly and routinely confused has allowed me to see things, to understand the experience of living in a world in which your body is interpreted one way and your authentic self entirely rejects that other imposed identification." After telling about some of her experiences in being treated as a man and being policed for being in women's spaces, she invites the reader to apply this thought to trans people. She wrote, "I assume my feminist sisters would reject the suggestion that I should be forced to transition my sex or identity to conform to a world that doesn't, on the whole, recognize my existence as a woman. Yet, in refusing to acknowledge trans women as women, this is, in effect, what such feminists are asking of trans women." Third, she says, it's not fair to put the burden of gender abolitionism onto trans people. She writes of a world in which sex roles disappear, in which gender is non-existent, or so completely fluid as to effectively be a non-category, and says, well, we don't live in that world, and are unlikely to. Why should trans women as individuals bear a special burden in getting us closer to it? Fourth, she speaks to the fact of female socialization and trans women's difference in that respect, but recasts that as the trans-exclusionary feminist saying merely that trans women are not women like me. Her response is that all women have different experiences, and there is no reason not to include the variation of trans women's experiences. Fifth, she suggests that instead of focusing on whether trans women are like women, we should focus on the way that they're related to men. The crucial question is, how do trans women stand in relation to men, to the forms of male power that function to subordinate women on the basis of sex? Are trans women subordinated on the basis of their sex? Are they subordinated on the basis of their place in the sex-gender hierarchy? She attributes trans women's social mistreatment as being on the basis of their sex. Watson follows that up with the suggestion that if they are subordinated on the basis of sex, then they are women. And if we deny that they are women only because they have a penis, that is biological essentialism, which in feminist philosophy and gender studies, just saying the name of biological essentialism is meant to be an argument in itself. Finally, sixth, if I have counted her reasons accurately, Watson addresses male privilege. She questions the trans-exclusionary feminist idea that once male privileged, always male privileged, and says that one could claim that trans women have male privilege in any traditional sense belies any serious knowledge of what trans women's lives are actually like. She also asks why feminists, who surely have as a goal that those socialized to masculinity give up or lose male privilege, refuse to accept that trans women might have done so. Okay, some brief responses. First, you can care about trans women, listen to trans women, try to understand trans women, empathize with trans women, and still not end up with any reason to believe trans women are women. These things are separate. Later in the paper, Watson writes, what follows from the refusal of recognition may not be precisely clear as to what such feminists think trans women should do or how they should live. Maybe they think, go ahead and be as feminine as you like, but do it with a male-identified body and don't claim to be a woman. Yes, that's exactly what radical and gender-critical feminists think. Second, Watson is a woman, because Watson is female, being wrongly treated as a man. That is not parallel to someone who is a man being treated as a man. She may be right that being treated in this way gives her some insight into the trans experience, but one can read her paper and come to the conclusion that people should get a bit more of a sense of the many ways a female person can look, rather than think that people should come to the conclusion that people are always what they say they are. On bathroom use, she wrote of a cleaner who questioned her right to be in the women's bathroom. It sure would be nice if she and others like her would grant that people like me know which bathroom we are in and have a good reason for being in there. On the fourth point, there's a difference between having something in common and also many differences. For example, we're all female, but only some of us are poor, and having nothing in common and also many differences. On the fifth, male power might be homophobic, but that doesn't make gay men women and doesn't make gay rights a project for feminism. Feminism doesn't have to accept all the projects. On the sixth point, I'll just note that when Marilyn Fry said that men should set themselves against masculinity, she noted that such disaffiliation was not a private act of will, not a personal strategy, and not something accomplished by simply thinking it possible. So it's not mere declaration of identity. We'll want to know who has done the work, and we'll need to figure out what we think that work consists in. So maybe once male privileged, always male privileged is false, but it's still not the case we should assume that someone has lost male privilege merely because he declares a gender identity. Okay, you might have noticed I skipped the third point, which I think is the only one we should clearly grant. If we are to abolish gender, that is everyone's job. And it's true that it's not fair to put the burden on one minority group only. But we must also be cognizant of the fact that when something is framed as for a beleaguered minority, it gets a lot of political traction, which means that the project of trans inclusion may disproportionately affect gender abolitionism. It is hard to simultaneously insist that gender is an arbitrary imposition of an ad hoc bundle of traits on the basis of sex, and that gender is incredibly important to trans people and must be affirmed and accommodated. Which is it? That's not a reason to disproportionately burden trans people, as though a man is wrong to dress pretty or sexy where a woman is off the hook for doing so. But it is a reason that it may yet be fair to burden trans people. Okay. For anyone who wants more on arguments for trans women are women and why, at least in my view, they don't work, I have an essay on this topic in my book Sex Matters, which you can read for free via the Phil Papers archive. And anyone interested in the question of what is gender identity and why I think it's important, which can also feed into the justification for sex abolitionism in law, I posted 2 videos on this topic in May. The first in lecture format and the second in discussion format, talking to the author Selin Davis. And I'll put the links to both in the video description. See you next week.